Hello friends and subscribers, welcome back to another edition of Readings in Impact Investing. My name is Daniel Rosehill. This is a new podcast which I set up at the very end of 2023, and it's intended to take useful written material in the field of impact investing, things like reports, even blog posts and web pages that are very good sources of information, and bring them into the audio world through reproducing them and publishing them as a podcast. You can find this podcast online at readingsiниmpact.org, and it also automatically syndicates onto YouTube. So if you prefer to listen to material through YouTube rather than on a podcast, although there is nothing but the cover art as the background, search YouTube for Readings in Impact Investing and you should be able to find that. So one of these terms that you come across a lot in the field of development finance is called fiscal space. So I went looking for a resource to explain what is intended by fiscal space, and I came across two different resources by this gentleman called Peter Heller, and I'm going to read the shorter one because brevity is always good. And this is from FD, which stands for Finance and Development, and it's the quarterly magazine of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And this article is a little more vintage than most of the material we've featured recently here. This was written back in 2005, but it remains relevant today as the term hasn't really changed, or the concept. And I reached out to the author, Peter Heller, who was then the Deputy Director of the IMF's Fiscal Affairs Department, and he kindly gave me permission to replicate it on this podcast. I just want to say, just to give a word, just to give Philip's background, because I feel like if I'm going to be reading his article, it's useful to know who the guy is. Peter Heller, PhD, economist, fiscal expert and public speaker. Peter Heller is a recognized expert on fiscal policy and public finance. He is the former Deputy Director of the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF, and he has advised both industrial and developing countries on broad macroeconomic policy strategies for over 30 years. So very, very impressive background. So let's read this article about fiscal space. Back to basics. Fiscal space, what is it and how to get it? Fiscal space is a term that has recently become fashionable in the aid community, but what it means is fuzzy. Sometimes the concept has cropped up when governments have argued that fiscal constraints should be relaxed to accommodate additional borrowing to finance infrastructure projects. The logic is that these projects create productive assets that pay for themselves over the long term, thus creating the fiscal space that they need. But recently the term has also been used by advocates of higher health and education outlays who have argued that these expenditures will eventually pay for themselves through higher returns to human capital. Although the term is new, the concept is not. It has long been an element of sound fiscal analysis, and the challenge of creating fiscal space is one that has always confronted governments and their advisors, including international financial institutions like the IMF. Defining fiscal space. What is fiscal space? It can be defined as room in a government's budget that allows it to provide resources for a desired purpose without jeopardizing the sustainability of its financial position or the stability of the economy. Because this definition is very important and really why I'm reading this blog, I'm going to actually just give it a second run through a bit more slowly. What is fiscal space? It can be defined as room in a government's budget that allows it to provide resources for a desired purpose without jeopardizing the sustainability of its financial position or the stability of the economy. The idea is that fiscal space must exist or be created if extra resources are to be made available for worthwhile government spending. A government can create fiscal space by raising taxes, securing outside grants, cutting lower priority expenditure, borrowing resources from citizens or foreign lenders, or borrowing from the banking system and thereby expanding the money supply. But it must do so without compromising macroeconomic stability and fiscal sustainability, making sure that it has the capacity in the short term and the longer term to finance its desired expenditure programs as well as to service its debt. So how can this be done? The government must ensure that the higher expenditure in the short term and any associated future expenditure, including any recurrent spending on operations and maintenance required by an infrastructure investment or by the establishment of a school or hospital, can be financed from current and future revenues. If debt financed, the expenditure should be assessed by reference to its efforts on the underlying growth rate and the country's revenue generating capacity. The government needs to be sure, in particular, that increased outlays in one worthwhile area, health for example, will not ultimately crowd out productive spending elsewhere. For developing and emerging market countries, fiscal space may seem a more immediate issue than in advanced economies because there are more pressing needs for expenditure today. But longer-term issues are also involved, even for lower-income countries, because of the need to ensure that there will be room to respond to unanticipated fiscal challenges. For example, countries that receive significant flows of foreign resources for a specific sector, such as healthcare, may, as a result of the associated expansion of the sector, face additional future spending needs that may essentially preempt a share of the growth of future domestic budgetary resources. Foreign resource inflows, such as aid, may hurt a country's macroeconomic situation, for example, by raising its real exchange rate and thus reducing its international competitiveness, or cause excessive aid dependency, so that such inflows may need to be limited. A foreign financed expansion of a specific sector, for example education, may then imply limits on the magnitude of foreign resources available to other sectors. Resource inflows may finance a government activity, such as pension reform, that creates a liability in the form of future payouts that are highly uncertain in magnitude and timing. The IMF's approach. What is the IMF's stance? When the IMF evaluates a country's macroeconomic situation, it is open to the creation of fiscal space through higher foreign grant inflows for spending on infrastructure or social programs. But the IMF would flag a concern if the higher spending jeopardized macroeconomic stability or debt sustainability. Such caution particularly extends to the use of central bank credit, given the IMF's concern with inflation and its damaging effects on growth and poverty. Moreover, higher spending in a sector, even if financed from external grant flows, may have implications for other sectors that will need to be taken into account. How is potential fiscal space determined? The IMF looks at both the scope for greater public saving through expenditure rationalisation and tax reform, and the extra resources that can be mobilised from borrowing and grants. It also appraises underlying factors that affect the outcome of government policies. Reprioritising expenditure. Curbing unproductive spending should be an important objective. This may require cuts in subsidies or military outlays, wage restraint, or rationalisation of elements of the civil service, including by tackling the common problem of ghost workers. But at the same time, productive spending needs to be protected. Not spending enough on a sector, say health, can have damaging social effects and prove to be a false economy, raising future spending requirements by weakening the sector so much that it would be costly and time-consuming to rebuild it. Boosting efficiency. Other aims should be to streamline the implementation of programs, reduce corruption, and improve governance. Donors can help by pairing conditionality, eliminating aid trying, reducing administrative overheads, better coordinating spending in its sector, and reducing the administrative overhead imposed on the limited number of recipient country program managers. Raising revenue. For countries with low ratios of government revenue to GDP, broadening the tax base and improving tax administration are likely to be important objectives. For low-income countries, a tax ratio of 15% of GDP should be seen as a minimum objective. Increased borrowing. Given that domestic and foreign borrowing must be serviced and repaid, policymakers need to evaluate whether the social return from the users to which the borrowing is put justifies the cost. Governments may choose to borrow without taking specific account of the direct returns, but then must do so when assessing the overall sustainability of a program. Such assessments typically weigh an economy's prospective growth rate, potential for exports and remittances, prospective interest rate environment, revenue elasticities, composition of existing debt in terms of interest rates, maturity and currency of borrowing, and terms of new debt being considered. The next section in the blog is the case of Malawi, Tanzania and Zambia, but I'm not actually going to read that because this blog was authored way back, relatively speaking, in 2005. So much has changed in the macroeconomic picture of these three countries since that I think it would be pointless to use them as an example because the example was relevant at that particular point in time. So let's just continue with monetary expansion. This is not a desirable option. A government's borrowing from the banking system should be driven by monetary policy objectives, namely the creation of sufficient liquidity to support an economy's real growth with no more than low inflation. Even if a government were explicitly to rely on money creation to facilitate somewhat higher government expenditure, there are clear limits given the potential inflationary impact. Securing more external grants. For many developing countries, this is increasingly feasible given the global commitment to help countries reach the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. And again, the MDGs, of course, we're now talking about the SDGs, but these were the foregoing set of global development goals. Grants can clearly provide more fiscal space than borrowing, where debt sustainability considerations have to be taken into account even when loans are highly concessional. But only a sustained and predictable flow of grants can create the potential for a scaling up of expenditure that can be maintained, and reduce the uncertainty as to whether a grant is simply of a one-time nature. And countries will need to take account of the potential macroeconomic consequences in terms of international competitiveness that may arise from a significant scaling up in absorption of external resource inflows. Pursuing sound macroeconomic policies. Delays in completing IMF program reviews or cessation of IMF-supported programs, which often results from a country's failure to implement agreed macroeconomic policies, can affect assistance from other lenders and donors and result in volatile flows. Countries that manage policies well are likely to have greater potential for creating extra fiscal space. Governments need to clarify with donors the likely availability of foreign assistance over the medium to long term and structure their expenditure programs accordingly. In sum, the fiscal space debate has proven useful, reflecting the importance of clarifying ways to facilitate expanded spending by governments to foster growth through higher infrastructure spending and to finance programs vital to the achievement of the MDGs, particularly those relevant to HIV/AIDS. The IMF is committed to working with countries to explore the scope for expanded fiscal space. So as I mentioned a few times, it's interesting that in this article, at the time they were talking about the MDGs with the target achievement date of 2015. But in the year 2024, we may be talking about the SDGs, but we're still very much talking about finding ways to finance the achievement of the SDGs and the challenges of the day, much as the HIV/AIDS was a massive challenge in the African continent at the time. Climate change is now the global environmental goal that is capturing a lot of the world's attention. I just wanted that's the end of the article, but I just want to actually read that definition one more time just to kind of tie this all together. What is fiscal space? It can be defined as room in a government's budget that allows it to provide resources for a desired purpose without jeopardizing the sustainability of its financial position or the stability of the economy. And that concept remains very, very relevant today when we're talking about ways that developing emerging markets and developing economies, which are now commonly abbreviated EDMEs, can find fiscal space in their budgets for the achievement of the SDGs. I hope this article was useful, the reading of this article. Thank you very much to Peter Heller for kindly giving me permission to replicate it on this podcast. Please consider passing this podcast around with your friends and colleagues if they would also like to learn about impact investing and development finance through the replication of these textual resources from some of the leading financial and research institutions in the world, including the IMF, who I hope I will have plenty of opportunity to explore their reports in the course of this podcast. Thanks for listening, and until the next episode.